Good morning. My name is Steve Ross, and I am a business agent and a member of the ILWU Local 500 here in Vancouver, Canada.
So, Steve, how did these displays come about, and what's the reason for putting them up?
It's our 50th anniversary of the amalgamation of Local 500. Back in the early 60s, there were several small locals that needed to merge to become a stronger entity to fight the employer for better rights and benefits and working conditions. And as a result, Local 500 was born. And so we have decided to commemorate this occasion with a dinner and dance and historical displays of both past and present for our members and the public to view.
Okay, so the displays represent what in your mind, and the reasons for those displays?
The displays, in my mind, they represent a world that is far older than all of us today, and how things have changed, how the world has changed both politically and how the world has changed both mechanically. Where 100 years ago you needed 100 men on a ship, and today you only need 20 men on a ship.
Can you please just walk through and show us some of the displays that were made for this occasion?
Absolutely, follow me.
So, Steve, what was the vision of displays that you put together here when you were originally asked to do this
Well, as soon as I found out that I had the privilege of putting together an educational and historical viewing for both ourselves, for our members, our casuals, and our public, it was really about how do I take extremely historical photographs and gear and mix it with things that we use today. And the challenge was to educate people, not only the public, but ourselves, on how the world has changed around us. And by bringing things that we use today that people have only been on the waterfront for a couple years, by bringing things in that they use on a daily basis on the docks versus what we would have used 50 or 60 years ago, it helped us to bring a better understanding as to where we are going in the future.
So what were some of the challenges that you had getting this historical pictures and hooks and everything else that's now on the display today here for the public?
When it came to, really, it was a lot of long hours and detailed research in our archives, as well as the Vancouver City Archives, public libraries, and also some of the terminals had photographs and documents that were tucked away in old drawers and behind filing cabinets that were forgotten about. And so, again, hours and hours of archive searching in order to find things that made sense to us.
Did a lot of the companies help you in this process of developing and making these displays?
So when we talk about the union and the company, I was at a conference in Australia and a couple of years ago, and I met a fellow from the Netherlands. And one of the things he said, he was one of the union reps from Rotterdam, and what he said to me is, the way the world works when it comes to unions and to companies, corporations, is there's boxing and dancing. And sometimes you're going to be boxing with them, and sometimes you're going to be dancing with them. And one of the things that made it easy when I had certain challenges getting certain parts of the gear into our auditorium for display was the companies were willing to dance with us as opposed to box, because they understand the importance of not only history but education.
Can you explain the display behind you and to the left of you and how they came about?
So the display that you see behind me on both the left and the right, we have a grain terminal. Part of the reason why I've done the different cargo boxes is because when I was a kid, I could go out with my father onto the terminals, onto the docks, because there was no fear of security breach, or the world that we live in today is a lot different. Every individual, in order to get onto a terminal, you need to have a security card and you need to swipe through. So I got to see these things up close and personal when I was a kid. I got to ride in equipment and machinery and go up cranes with my father. Today we can't do that, so I've brought that to us here. And then if you look at all the different cargo boxes we have, is a wide range of different bulk commodities that are carried across the waterfront. It's been known for many years that Vancouver, BC, that the Port of Vancouver is one of the most diverse ports in North America and has one of the largest amounts of both import and export of cargo.
Steve, can you explain the historical display that you have that's in front of you there?
So, you know, there's a lot of things that we do, and when we talk about being a diverse port, we're not the only port that facilitates cruise ships, but we have been doing cruise ships here in the Port of Vancouver, I think since ships could get under a bridge. If you look in this picture, it's not just about lumber, it's not just about containers, but we are also in the business of transporting people on holiday destinations. At one time, it wasn't just about a cruise where you could go and eat and be merry and gamble and do all those fun things. It was also a way of entry for immigrants into the country and out of the country.
Steve, can you explain the container ship that's behind you, and as well as some of the display that's to the side of you, and how you came about doing this?
So this container ship here is actually on loan from us from GCT, Global Container Terminals, which was formerly TSI Systems Incorporated. In the Port of Vancouver, like many of the other cargoes, a lot of things were done, as you will hear from some of our pensioners, everything was done by hand back in the day. But as the world changes and mechanization comes into play, things are now going into containers in mass volume. And this particular ship here, it can carry upwards of 5,000 and 6,000 containers on one trip. And everything that we have, everything that we are wearing, a lot of the electronics, our automobiles, you know, everything that we use in our everyday life, there's a good chance that it came through the Port of Vancouver, through a container, and we were your handler.
So Steve, can you explain this beautiful display and how you envisioned this and how this all came about?
So one of the things that when I came down to our auditorium and I knew I was putting this display on was, as soon as I walked in through the door, I realized that I wanted to have a ship involved. I needed a good portion of a ship to be built in the auditorium, and this is our home and this was the space to do it. So what you don't see is behind the ship is actually some doorways and some different corners. So as soon as I saw that, I realized that's the place to build our cargo ship. And it wasn't just about building a ship, but it was about building a ship that had some old school rigging on it and gear. So this was one of the big challenges we had, was putting the ship together and making it feel realistic for our guests. So this is sort of the end of our tour. I'd like to thank everybody for participating in it and all the guests that came through. But more importantly, I'd like to thank the ILWU and all the people that helped us put this together, from our carpenters and our painters to our welders, the terminals, and all of my crew that helped us put extremely long hours in, up till 5:30 in the morning, to put this together. From the bottom of my heart, I'd like to thank everybody. And an injury to one is an injury to all. As you can see, our charters are extremely important to us. And here to tell you more about the amalgamation and what the charters mean, Dave Lomas and John Corsito.
Okay, my name is Dave Lomas. I'm a retired longshoreman. I spent many years as an officer of both the Canadian area and of Local 500. And I'm here with John Corsito, and John is the only person left who was the president of both Local 501 and Local 500. And we're here to talk about the amalgamation of the 5, 6, or 7, depending on how you count them, locals that merged into Local 500. Okay, the amalgamation of all of the locals in Vancouver actually started years before the 1966 date. It started right after the Battle of Ballantine in 1935, when they started to put together, with the help of our international union, a fighting force up here in British Columbia to prevent the employers from breaking our union, which they did in the previous 20, 30, 40 years. So what happened was the locals in British Columbia started to get together first to deal with organizing and negotiating a first contract, And then subsequently they decided to amalgamate and form one organization in the Vancouver area, because every other area already had their own organization. So really that's what it was all about. It was all about strength and putting together the unity of the independent organizations that were around, so the employers couldn't pick us all off individually and had to negotiate with one major struggle or one major organization.
You pretty well covered it all. About the main advantage that I got involved with amalgamation in 1963. The reason why, in my opinion, now these are my opinions now, but I was there when it happened, and is we had different casual workforces and all over the coastwise, the warehouse, deep sea, and the surplus work never was interchanged to different locals. And I'm talking about the longshore to grain liners to warehouse and the rest of it. There was no interchange. And that was the first move. Now, who started this off? I couldn't tell you. I know the International had come along, and Harry Bridges couldn't get across the border, so we had Bob Robinson up here, and we were very fortunate to have Craig Pritchett as the Canadian area president, the first Canadian area president, and then the international rep. Then he was the regional director. And I'm pretty sure he's the one that probably masterminded it, because it was a hell of a struggle. We had an executive, how big was it, 22 members. And everybody trying to protect their own job, a little bit of their turf, you know, it was unknown. And, but we got through that part of it, and it gradually pared it down, but we had the interchange of work by that time. We still had two contracts. We had the Shipment Federation, and we also had the wharf operators. And they finally, we had a revolution in 1958, I guess. That was Roy Smith came on the scene, and he had the younger group in the Deep Sea Local 501, vote against two people that were willing to do the same job for $1 a year. And he was going on staff. So that was the breaking point. That's where the longshore started, and we've never looked back from that day forward. We've got our nose in the...
So the companies must have been fighting.
Oh yeah, they're losing their autonomy, you see. And they didn't want the interchange, they wanted their own workforces and all the rest of it, and then we finally integrated the whole thing, and it's worked out great right to today.
My name's Herb Howell. Worked on the waterfront since 61, 63 came back on a regular basis, and this is Bert.
Bert Forsyth. I started in 66 at Vancouver Wharves when the tradesmen first started coming in. I was a machinist at Vancouver Wharves. Me and my partner Ernie Marsan. Lots of people remember Ernie Marsan. This was in the era before Bert and Ernie hit the TV. But we made a good combination, repaired a lot of stuff. We worked in the maintenance in the bulk dock, fixing this and fixing that. Ernie was a great welder, and with my little talent there as a machinist, there wasn't too much that we couldn't fix for them. They were pretty happy with us for a lot of years.
Yeah, it ended up, myself, I started in the trades, late 60s, and carried on everything from mechanic to millwrighting, and then I moved over to being a bulk operator at Neptune, the Wharves, and all the other places. So we got a fairly good cross-section of what was happening on the bulk sites. Repair end of it, we were responsible to make sure that everything didn't rust through and fall down, which at times was difficult. In places like Vancouver Wharves with the sulfur and the potash, that stuff ate the steel away like crazy. Got into a lot of confrontations with the employer because they wanted to keep working and do it the cheap, and we tried our damnedest to make them work in a safe manner. There were quite a number of accidents. some fairly serious accidents, collapses of ship loaders where
Conveyor belt.
conveyors and things like that, where we had, there was fires, like the sulfur, it was kind of strange the way it burned and did stuff to the lungs. But yeah, we did a fairly good job keeping everything working and putting lots of tonnage aboard and still having the employer be responsible for safety and good working conditions.
Good guys to work with. We
Yeah.
had a lot of fun. I wouldn't change a thing if I had to do it again.
Yeah.
The changes from then to now.
Well, the changes were pretty drastic. You know, I remember the old sacking plant at the Vancouver Wharves where we started off, you know, sacking potash and sacking sulfur, stacking it on boards and then taking it aboard. And then the conveyors came, you know, the ship loaders, they got faster and bigger and better and
More dangerous.
the same as the conveyors, they kept speeding them up and, you know, it just, you load a lot of cargo. Remember at Neptune, it used to be like when they were loading coals, they were happy with 9, 10, 12,000 ton a shift. I think they're up close to 40,000 ton a shift now. So that's how they speeded things up and, you know, the workers that are there, there's less and less. They keep seeming to get more done with less workers and they try to get people to do 3 different jobs if they can get away with it. So yeah, it definitely has changed.
Yeah.
Like Neptune now, I hear they've gone all to stainless steel so it doesn't rot. You know, less maintenance and you know, so on and so forth. Yeah. Anything else?
That's good for me. I'm a happy boy.
Okay, thank you very much.
My name's Ted Grucut. I'm a retired member from Local 500. Came in the union in 1967 and retired in 2007.
So Ted, can you just explain to us the changes that you've seen over your lifetime of moving break bulk from, you know, the original loading everything through the holds to containerized cargo and all that, the changes you've seen, the automation and...
Well, when we first started in the waterfront, you know, in the early 60s and the mid 60s, everything was done by hand. Probably in the middle to late 60s, you'd see some containers. There was some from North Vancouver on the Rogers. Maybe there's another fella can talk about that more. But we used to get the odd one coming in on the general cargo ships, and they were 8x8 containers. Some on the Blue Star line and other lines were gradually starting to incorporate them in, and you know, and the rumor was this is going to be the future, and you know, that's kind of the way it started, and so and then it got to bigger ships and more containers on them, and then they started, and I remember, I think it was in 1971 when Centerm opened with the container ships coming in and had their straddle carriers and dock entry cranes. And as you can see the pictures over here, I guess they're on the camera there. And so they were, the straddle carriers were actually a very versatile machine. It didn't take a whole lot of room to turn around or whatever. They weighed 47 ton empty. And they could stack 20-foot containers 3 high and 40-footers 2 high. And you sat sideways in the machine, actually, and you drove a lot of it by mirrors. There was a big mirror down here and one on the other side of the machine, and it was kind of a different, it was a learning experience, to say the least, when you first get in the machine, right? So, but they were really a good machine, and you know, and and then it progressed from there. You know, you got then dock entries come in, and we were even at that time we were loading you know, probably 25 cans an hour, you know, and sometimes more, sometimes less, depends on circumstances. But you know, it seemed to run pretty well, and you know, it progressed over time. Did a lot of the freight loading. of containers on the terminals at that time. So the straddle carriers are bringing loads into the sheds, and as well as loading trucks and as well as loading and unloading the ships, feeding the dock entry cranes. And usually have three machines to a dock entry, and you would keep going, and then ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and but it has changed over time. The ships have gotten bigger, bigger cranes, better equipment, a lot quicker, and a lot of it is a lot easier. Now they use tractor trailers, and the straddle carriers went in 1987. They brought in rubber-tired gantries, and again, it was a learning experience all over again, right? So you're driving like mini cranes. And the RTGs that they brought in here to start at van term, well, the straddle carriers come up from Centerm in '74, I believe it was, and it was all gravel at the time with limestone mixed in. It was very dusty, and really not a very good place to work, because the dust was phenomenal sometimes. And gradually it got paved over and everything, and then in 1987 they switched over to rubber-tired gantries. And the rubber-tired gantries were basically fair weather machines when they first came. And so the first winter you'd get like an inch of snow and the machine wouldn't work. So they had to adapt all the heads and and do different things like that to make them operate in a year-round position, in the year-round climate. So, but they got over that, and in a short period of time, got over that, worked the bugs out, and now it's I haven't been on that type of a job for many, many years, but from what I understand, it runs quite efficient, and they load a lot of containers, and it's probably the biggest cargo coming from the port, I guess, and that's about it.
Well, my name is Mike Marino, and I've been retired now for almost 17 years, but I worked in the waterfront. I guess I started actually in January 1964. I've been a merchant seaman for about 14 years prior to that, so I'd like to just talk a little bit about these older ships and some of the cargoes they used to load at the time, and the big change in lumber. Lumber has always been a huge export here, and over the years it's changed completely. Years ago we had ships with standing gear, as you can see. We'd load mainly off of scows, because most of the docks at that time, there were actually no lumber docks. The ships were just tied up to finger piers, and scows were brought alongside by tugs, and the lumber was all in random lengths and had to be stowed down below by hand, each piece by hand. So it was a time-consuming job. Sometimes it would take 3 weeks or a month to load a ship. They'd have 8 men down below, 4 men on each side, loading off the scow, as I say. You had older ships, a lot of wartime built ships with steam. So they would have 2-winch drivers and a guy to tend hatch to actually, kind of signal. So it's changed completely. They went from that type ship to ships that were built to carry cargoes like that without wings, no wings like in the hold itself. So you could lift up huge lengths, modules of lumber, and just stack them down in the hatch. No hand handling at all. And now it's got to the point where I understand a lot of the lumber is now going out in cans. So it's completely changed. You look around at the X, I guess you would say, the lumber docks that we had here in the past, there's hardly any lumber on them. But that's the main change, I would say, and especially with lumber, it was such a huge amount of it going out, and there was so much manpower involved. So this is completely changed. You never see ships like this at all anymore. Not only that, a lot of the other ships, they came in here and they had all mixed cargoes, general cargoes, every kind of thing that goes into department stores, all the liquor, everything was all hand-handled. They'd have a certain amount of men down below, and every piece was put on a pallet board, and then it was lifted out onto the dock with cranes or winches, taken into sheds, and then sorted by hand. Some of it stored right there, a lot of it loaded onto trucks, and then a lot of it going into rail cars. So there was a ton of work. So I'm sure it's changed an awful lot today, but that's what I remember mainly is about the change in from loading by hand to what we have today, with very few people involved, but and a lot more tonnage going out on much larger ships.
The wheat section of the waterfront was for years never ever part of the local 501 or the longshore section. It was always just an adjunct section that most of the deep sea longshoremen didn't want to work anyway because it was too dirty and too dusty. And the wheat section of the Vancouver local was the last section to come into local 501. We used to work wheat. One of the stories that a lot of people tell who were brought up around the same time I was when we used to go trimming grain on ships with tanks. And what they used to do is they used to bury you under the tanks, and you would have to dig yourself out. And usually what would happen is they would bury you about 10 or quarter to 12, and you'd have to try and dig yourself out of the hole and get out before lunchtime. And if you didn't, you spent half your lunchtime down below in the ship. The other thing that they used to do it's a wonder we never had any deaths or accidents, is they used to give you candles, and you would take candles down below in the deck of the ship, and that was the only lights you had, was candles. And like I say, that it's amazing that nobody was ever killed or nothing ever blew up on that. We used to do a lot of sacking jobs in the 60s down here, and they would hire 60, 70 trimmers from deep sea to go board a ship, and you'd have a big scoop down below, and you would scoop the grain into sacks, and you'd pile the sacks up on top of the grain so the grain wouldn't shift during the voyage.
My name is Gary Green. I started on the waterfront in 1961. I found that if you worked on the waterfront, you had the respect of your brothers, and I got into membership in 1965, and I could see the writing on the wall. In 1966, amalgamation vote was held, and I could see the machinery only getting bigger and faster, and so that's why I voted for amalgamation. It was the best thing that ever happened to the ILWU in the Port of Vancouver. I took over a gang in 1970 and had the gang for 6 years, and then after that I went foreman for Western Stevedoring, and where I was there for 27 years. But the ILWU is one of the greatest things that ever happened to me in my lifetime. Belonging to the ILWU was the greatest thing for the foreman, the longshoreman. You could move from longshoring to foreman, and you had credibility in the industry and the respect of people. You could be in management or you could be in labor. Didn't matter. As long as you're a good brother, you got credibility, you got the job done.
Hi, I'm David Kosha, executive member for Local 500. Just speaking about the history of the waterfront, my grandfather was in the Battle of Ballantine. My uncles, my father, my brothers, we've all played a part in contributing to the history of this local. Been many changes since I started in 1980. Work was a lot more strenuous, and the automation that has happened today has changed the workforce as far as the job descriptions. But the history of the waterfront is a rich tradition, and although things have changed in the way we handle the cargo, we have to stay militant and united, maybe more so now than in the past. And it's, as you can see by the display behind me and throughout this auditorium, the history that we have is definitely worth fighting for, and we have to always remember where we came from as we move forward in our future.
Yeah, my name's Gordy Westrand. I started longshoring in July of 1965. I continued to work for 45 years until October of 2010. Many of the people here I knew from 65 on anyways, and then the rest, a lot of them I knew because we knew their kids, the ones who died on the Green Park, for instance, in 1945. When I first came down here, safety wasn't an issue. All the workers wanted safety, regulations to be improved, but overall, we worked with gear that was frayed and it's very secondary. We started committees. I take pride in the fact that the first committee I ever was on was the safety committee, and I became chairman the first year that I was on that committee. We started bringing in things like bulletins, and we started dealing with the safety issues. In the 1970s and 80s, we lost a horrendous number of people, and we started reacting, and we started getting involved with compensation, Labor Canada, and we started improving things on the waterfront. Now we have decent training programs, we have decent safety programs, and the employer, I think, has also recognized it's to his advantage that people don't get hurt and killed. So it's been a long struggle. It's been a worthwhile struggle, and everybody should be proud of what the ILWU has done down here on the issue of safety. Thank you.
My name is Jolene Parent. I started down on the waterfront 11 years ago. So what brings us here today is we're looking at the National Day of Mourning, which is April 28th. And we actually have a number of names up on the board, and to date, even us celebrating 50 years, it's actually been 50 people that are documented, I'm sure some before then, who passed away on the job. And each and every one of them, a lot of the time it's because we're advocating for safety, advocating for a van, advocating for high-vis vests, or safety gear, and all of this stuff that we have today is really because people have fought for it, and unfortunately some people have died for it before the employers would actually implement it. National Day of Mourning is also recognized in over 100 different countries already, and the momentum is growing, and what we do, as you can see with the video, is we honor and recognize the people who've passed, honoring their families, their employees, their coworkers that are on the job still. And then the day of mourning, what we did have is we had also the casket, and we had each and everybody's names in the casket. So it was really dramatic when we showed up that day in silence and verbally recognized everybody's name and had everybody stand up to silently but impactfully recognize everybody who passed away on the job.